Hey, what's up guys? Pat here, and this is a video I've wanted to talk about for quite some time, and that is why I believe Senzu Bean as a card carries the Dragon Ball Super card game on its back, so to speak. It is the most important card, in my opinion, in the entire game, and I will go over my reasons for why I think that's the case, as well as give some general insight on game design and how they kind of address some of the issues I feel like Dragon Ball Super has, and explain why I feel like Senzu Bean is kind of like the game savior, so to speak, right now. So for those who don't know what Senzu Bean is, it is a 1-cost blue extra card with Activate Battle. Choose up to one of your cards. It gains plus 5,000 power for the duration of the turn. Then you choose up to 2 of your energy and switch them to active mode. So this card is obviously very strong. It showed up, I believe, in 86 point something percent of decks at Nationals, and it was played as a 4 of. Dusty O'Brien did a video of top 5 cards from Nationals, and I feel like he incorrectly picked the number 1 choice in his video. He said that Senzu Bean was the number 2 most important card at Nationals. I would argue it is the number 1 card from Nationals because I truly believe it is the most important card in the game, and I feel like if your deck is not playing Senzu Bean and is not androids, which is the one exception I can honestly think of, then you're probably doing something very wrong. So to segue, to get out of Senzu Bean here, when we segue into talking about game design, I'll come back to Senzu Bean first, but I'd like to give you guys just kind of a general idea of where I'm coming from. In good game design, for any competitive game, there should be some inherent balance between offense and defense. Consider a game like League of Legends, for example. In League of Legends, one of the premier offensive items is something called Infinity Edge. And even though I haven't played League in a while, it's usually cost-wise in somewhere around 3,000 gold in the game's currency. It takes a little bit to get to it. Conversely, items that counter Infinity Edge, such as Randuin's Omen, which I don't know if that's still in the game, those usually cost somewhere between 2,000 to 2,500 gold. So, and they're roughly the same power level in terms of what they do. And there's a reason why the defensive item that counters the Infinity Edge is cheaper. Number one, when you're behind in most games, you have less resources in general, and you also have less opportunities to come back into the game because you've made a mistake at some point. Defense allows for games to be stabilized rather than allow them to spiral out of control. If your game does not have a good balance between offense and defensive tools are not cheaper or strong enough to overcome the offensive options, then the game becomes very, very snowbally. 2. Attacking in most competitive games is usually how you win. If defense is the same cost or more as attacking, from a competitive standpoint as a player, it is simply smarter for you to just play aggressively and forego defense entirely. Think of it this way. Defense is how you don't lose the game until you can set up a situation where you can win. If defense is so, poor, or the cost ratio is so skewed, just play the card that wins. There's no reason for you to just waste turns trying to not lose the game when the options to win are just strictly better. So, another example of a game. Let's consider Overwatch. Overwatch, for you guys who don't know, is a very fast-paced shooter, and in that game, damage is somewhat high. And it is played competitively as an esport, and one of the reasons I feel like it succeeds competitively is because teams take turns vying over objectives, and they have one time they're on offense, the next time they might be on defense. And one of the big things that helps that game is the existence of different classes and roles, specifically in this case tanks and healers. Tanks usually have higher health than the average character. That means they can soak more damage from the enemy team. They also usually have abilities that help mitigate damage or prevent your opponent from doing specific things. So that's helpful in controlling the pace of the game and not allowing your opponent to just do whatever they want without repercussions. It keeps the DPS in check. Other things that keep DPS in checks, like I said, are healers. Healers on average in that game heal more than the damage that the average damage dealer will put out. This is usually referred to as a healer pocketing you. You may have heard that phrase before. But if a healer is pocketing somebody and a DPS tries to kill the pocketed person, they won't be able to deal enough damage to out heal the person. So that forces them to change their strategy and deal with the healer or deal with the tank that's protecting the healer, or so on and so forth. It creates a system of counterplay where players actually have to think about what they're doing, and they actually have to weigh the cost and of defense versus offense and vice versa. So now if you think about these theories, it should hold true in a well-designed, balanced card game. A lot of these principles should work. Defense again should inherently be cheaper than offense. Why would you print answers to cards, if they're not cheaper or more efficient than the cards that they're meant to remove? Because if they're not, then why wouldn't you just play the card in general anyway? For example, we have, Boragos, who's going to be printed soon, who's a 1-cost card that's supposed to answer specific energy untapping cards. The problem is that most of those cards are cards that are free. The answer card is more expensive than the problem card. So that is somewhat of an issue that may need to be addressed, and the card may not be as good as many people are thinking about. So that is basically one problem I do have with Dragon Ball Super in general, and I'm basically going to just get into some other examples of problems that I have with in terms of this balance and this game design when it comes to thinking about the game as a whole. So let's just go over some of the problems that I feel like need to be somewhat addressed in the game, and some of the issues that I see with the actual game as a core game itself. So number one, the combo system in this game inherently favors the attacker, and that's not necessarily a bad game thing, that's just an observation, but you can understand from what I'm going to explain to you why it could be a bad thing. In the event of a tie, the attacker wins. That means in order to not take damage, the enemy must spend 1 card. So in a defensive position, you are inherently disadvantaged because you have to spend more cards to not lose the game from a defensive position, which, as we just established, when you're in defensive position should be slightly stronger or more efficient than an offensive position, at least early on. So continuing on, since everything is haste, which we'll talk about in a second, what I mean by that, should an opponent threaten an attack with multiple attackers, like if they play multiple 1-drops, like Bardock, Goten, Fluted, Bardock, Goten on turn 1, that is a card that you have to spend if you don't want to take damage for each one of those. So just again, being aggressive in this game, you're rewarded way more in terms of card advantage, more so than any other card game I think I've ever played. 2, the universal haste problem. So what I mean by that is haste is a keyword in Magic the Gathering, which means that creatures that you play, in this case battle cards, can attack and perform all of their actions the turn they are put in play. In other card games such as Yu-Gi-Oh, I know that they also have universal haste, but not every card game has. And it's usually a pretty big balancing factor in many of the games that do have it. Having the 1-turn cooldown before cards can just do all of the things that they're meant to do allows players to strategize and gives them breathing room to react to big threats rather than just having them come out of nowhere and just wipe you off the face of the planet. So since every battle card does have haste in Dragon Ball Super, that means that every card is inherently aggressive. And like I said, powerful cards have to be reacted to instantly. And sometimes in a case of a card like Gogeta Hero Revive, it is literally impossible to react to said card. So you can see why this is a big issue. And since we are roughly about a year and something into the game's life cycle, it's a little bit too late to change it. So they, as designers for this game, need to be aware of this problem, and they need to be designing around it. From what I've talked to them before and what I've heard other people say before, they view Dragon Ball as an IP as something that kind of fundamentally represents aggression, and that's fine. I do like the fact that this game is a little bit more aggressive sometimes than I am used to. It kind of gets me out of my comfort zone. But with inherent power creep in the game and this design, you are essentially going to always be fighting with a very fast game, and that compressed fast games don't necessarily mean healthy games that last long. If we were to try to change it, even now, say for whatever reason the players were like, hey, we 100% all are on board with this, no more universal haste, just get rid of it, you'd have a really serious problem with certain cards in the pool. A lot of cards would no longer work correctly. See Overwhelm, for example. And then certain other cards like Kami's Power Piccolo would just basically break the format. So again, they can't just decide to just change it because one, we're late in the game, and two, if we did do it, the card pool was not balanced around the mechanics working like that. So yeah. So number 3, and probably the most controversial one that I wanted to hit on, was that defensive options that we have in this game are bad. They just are. Almost universally, every single defensive option in this game is bad. Even the ones you think are good are bad. So consider Bardock the Progenitor. The card is a 1-cost 10k. That means that as soon as you play it, because it has, again, universal haste, it can threaten damage because it's a 10k, and almost every leader in the game is a 10k on the front. When you play, normally in other games, when you play a 1-cost, creature or character that has haste, you go -1 because you took from your 6-card hand, you played 1 card down, you went down to 5 cards, so you went -1 when you play it. But since it takes a life to hand, it becomes a +0, and that's a recurring theme with a lot of 1-drops in this game. They can actually threaten damage, and they cost very little, and they replace themselves. So that is pretty much a design issue when it comes to balancing, because the earlier game cards have as much impact as many of the mid and late game cards, because they can still threaten relevant damage for basically no cost to you. So now consider, on the flip side, the average 1-cost defensive card. When most people think of 1-cost defensive cards, you are thinking of your negates. Think about Whisa's Coercion. Whisa's Coercion, -1s yourself when you play it. So you will go from 6 cards to 5 cards, just like you would with Bardock, or when you would play it, but Bardock draws back up the card. So in head-to-head, Bardock basically comes out 1 card ahead, and then when you think about what it does as well there, Bardock also sticks on board. So he is a better energy investment for 1 cost than Whisa's Coercion, and that's what I'm talking about. Offensive options are better than defensive ones when it comes to the cost ratio. So now let's consider some of the other ones. Most blockers in the game that cost 1 are 5Ks. They are not 10Ks like Bardock, so that means they cannot threaten damage. And because they are 5Ks, because attack and defense in this game are homogenized, they're the same number, it can actually defend itself versus any relevant 1-drop aggressive threats without spending 2 to 3 cards, which means it's not going to live without any kind of serious investment. Also, they don't replace themselves via draw, so they are -1s. Honestly, what I'd like to see is like 1-cost 15k power cards with blocker that potentially might, say that have the effect of permanent, this card can't attack. I'd like to see basically walls in this game so that you could actually slow down the game. I would actually just like to see the 1 and 2 drop blockers actually be relevant in this game for the most part. So, and more recently, when we talk about defensive options, we're thinking about Dimension Magic, Shocking Death Ball, Time Magic, and After Image Technique, I believe, are the 4 from Series 5. These ones are the closest that we have to being on equal footing with a card like Bardock or Sankaba when it comes to the equality in terms of, offense and defense ratio. Like I say, these cards are +0 because you can take the life for them, and they are basically free. The problem is that they are not reliably free in the time frame that we as players need them because of how regularly compressed the game is. And again, because it doesn't sit on board like a card like Bardock, it is inherently worse in terms of what it does for the game state. Again, defense doesn't actually help improve your situation on board. It just kind of says hey, I don't have to spend 4 cards, I can just spend this 1, or hey, I might not die this turn. Again, when you compare it to something like Intensifying Spirit Trunks, that card just is pure advantage for no cost in terms of taking aggressive actions. So yeah, like I was saying, the model basically for defense needs to be greater than offense. Right now, fundamentally, it's pretty much broken, and there are multiple ways we can fix it, but that's something for another video. But I just want to acknowledge and present to you guys that, hey, this model is broken. When you compare it to other competitive games, it's broken. Even when you compare it to other card games that are not Yu-Gi-Oh, it is fundamentally broken. And even then, I would argue that Yu-Gi-Oh has more defensive options than this game that can help balance out this this offense versus defense ratio. One last card I want to hit on is Flying Nimbus. This is one of the game's most popular defensive cards and is seen as one of the better ones. And this card inherently is also terrible when it comes to this ratio, because it is most likely a -2, and then your opponent is going to get, when played optimally, at least 2 more swings at you, which means that's going to be at least another 2 cards out of your hand. So most of the time when you play Flying Nimbus, it is -4 for you to the offensive person's +0. So that if a potential -4 is what most people consider to be really strong in terms of defensive options, that's pretty sad, and that's why, again, I'm making this video to call attention to this. So now we enter Senzu Bean, and Senzu Bean basically addresses and fixes all of these 3 problems. Number 1, the combo system inherently favoring an attacker. With Senzu Bean, you are inherently fixing this combo system because you're basically shifting the ball into the defender's favor. Suddenly, the defender is now in a position of strength, and it requires actual resources from the attacker to push through any amount of meaningful advantage. Most people are playing 10 to 15k attackers. When you Senzu Bean a leader up to 15 or 20k, they have to spend, they're in the position now of spending 1 card per attack in order to block, to actually push through damage, as opposed to it being reversed where you are, as the defender, spending 1 card per attack. So that's, really good. Again, just awesome. Players can also jam battle cards and swing through immediately with them, but again, for each leader swing that they get and on your leader that is Senzu Bean, you effectively are going to net an extra card. So number 2, universal haste problem. It's the only good defensive option versus a system that rewards aggression, because it gives you more defensive options that allow you to actually combat this flaw. I don't want to actually, I should say flaw. You can consider it a flaw or not. It depends on you, but in my eyes, it's basically a flaw. So one of the issues with the game, Senzu Bean is just the only good defensive option against it because it offers you more defensive options. So in a world basically where 1-cost cards offensively threaten damage and they +0 themselves, no one is going to play cards that are 1-cost 10k combos that also cost 1 energy to not take the damage. That's just how it is. Senzu Bean's ability to basically restand energy and refund you the one you paid for allows players to actually play defense. They can actually mount a defense, or they can use cards like Mafuba reliably without getting punished too hard for it. So when you consider a card like Senzu Bean in tandem with Infernal Villainy Cell, it ends up being a +0 that actually allows us to stabilize the game and play for a long game. My top 32 Janimba deck was based entirely around this principle. It used Senzu Bean in tandem with these pseudo super combos to mount a defense that would make the game go long enough where I can mill you, or actually play late game or mid game relevant cards that could actually push through the game. We were trying to uncompress the game through this same theory of just using Senzu Bean. So when the problem though with this is, even though Senzu Bean does help when it comes to Senzu Bean plus Unbreakable or Senzu Bean plus Infernal Villainy Cell, the problem is the Bardock in this advantage still somewhat wins out, because yes, the Senzu Bean is allowing you to be more efficient in terms of cards, and it is allowing you to basically compete with them in terms of energy efficiency. The Bardock is still a permanent threat, and the Bardock is actually being used to win the game as opposed to not losing the game. So this is the closest we have to a really solid defensive option because of its ability to allow us to play more defensive options efficiently. So yeah, those are basically the major 2 things. That kind of just transitions, like I said, into the third one there about how defensive options are bad. Again, Senzu Bean just makes those less bad. And I know that a lot of people said that they hated that the SS3 format and they're glad it was banned, but honestly, I really think that SS3 Goku having 3 energy at the end of each of your turns was a godsend in terms of like fixing the game's problems and mechanics. I feel like players could actually outplay each other and have meaningful exchanges and actually play uncompressed games. They could actually go back and forth, and that was really good because it felt like defense mattered. It didn't feel like defense was just so weak, compared to that format. And Senzu Bean, like I said, is basically the closest that we have to it. Um, yeah, so I know it sounds like I'm rambling, but basically what I am trying to say is, at the end of the day, we need more cards like Senzu Bean, at least defensively. I don't want people to be like, oh, we need a Senzu Bean for every color, because then, and you use it offensively and get access to more energy to extend plays. That's not what I'm asking for. What I'm asking for is I want more cards where I get advantage the longer my opponent tries to aggress upon me, like that I do with Senzu Bean. Senzu Bean, like I said, gets me a +1 effectively every time my opponent swings at me because they're spending cards to counter my one Senzu Bean. It's just great value. You get 3 for 1, 4 for 1 on Senzu Bean sometimes when it's played in, in the correct circumstance. I would like to have, cards that are more like that. If After Image was a card that, actually was, instead of being plus 40,000 power, was say like plus 20,000 power for the turn, I would really like that card a lot more because it really, puts a halt into people just trying to jam cheap, powerful cards as fast as possible and abuse the fact that there is no, real stopgap or no limiter that stops them from doing that. So, yeah, where we're at now, if they don't print more cards like Senzu Bean, is basically Senzu Bean will continue to be the go-to card for competitive play, in my opinion. I cannot honestly see a reason why you wouldn't play Senzu Bean in any deck, because it honestly addresses all 3 of these issues that I'm talking about here in this video. The only one you could possibly get away with is androids, and that's just because they're blessed with 2 very powerful cards on turn 2, Deadly Defender 18 and then the Energy Guard Android 17. Those 2 cards effectively cost 2, can put board presence on board and still protect your life. So it's one of the only, those are basically the only other cards you can realistically play that, affect the board in some meaningful way and still protect your life for a pretty solid, ratio for defense versus offense. No other decks can really do that. The other Deadly Defenders at 3 basically outright fail the defense versus offense, whereas, like I said, 18 is basically fine. It's also, the fact that they have, Cell Chain. That's a really broken thing, so they have that going for them too. So if you're not playing androids and you consider yourself a competitive player, you have literally 0 reason to not run 4 Senzu Beans. It was an 87% almost of every deck at Nationals as a 4 of for a specific reason, and I don't know if players realize that reason. And hopefully, like I said, this is a little bit rambly, but hopefully I feel like this discussion or this video kind of helps you guys understand why that's the case. It fundamentally, again, addresses the issues with the game. It is the only card that allows us to play basically real interactive games that go long and actually have more room for skill and more room through navigating, the defensive and offensive, portions of the combo step. So hopefully this was helpful to you guys. If you guys agree with it, let me know in the comments down below. If you disagree with it, then obviously you can let me know there as well. If you enjoyed it, give me a like. If you really enjoyed it, please consider subscribing. I'm coming up on 1,000 subs. When I do that, I will probably do a pretty big giveaway. I don't know what it is yet. So yeah, there you go, guys. That's my take on Senzu Bean, and I will see you guys in the next video.